The rain came down in hard, stinging sheets, turning the Brooklyn sidewalk into a slick river of glistening asphalt and discarded coffee cups. Melanie Carter darted between puddles with the practiced grace of someone who had been late more times than she could count. Her hood was up, her jacket soaked through, and her sneakers squelched with every hurried step. She muttered curses under her breath as she glanced at the time on her cracked phone screen. 5:57 p.m. If she sprinted, she could maybe clock in at the diner without getting chewed out. Again, a gust of wind shoved her sideways, and she almost missed the shape slumped against the graffiti-tagged brick wall. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught a flicker of movement. A leg jerked, a hand twitched. Melanie stumbled to a halt. People streamed past without a glance, faces buried in hoods and phones, eyes deliberately blind. She turned, squinting through the rain. He was crumpled like laundry tossed in a corner, one arm limp across his chest, the other stretched toward the sidewalk. His clothes, what was left of them, was soaked and torn. Mud-caked shoes, pale skin like porcelain left too long in the cold. She hesitated. "You're late." Again. "He's probably just drunk." But then he groaned. A thin, rasping sound that didn't belong to someone sleeping off a bender. Melanie dropped to her knees beside him. Hey, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, bloodshot, sunken, confused. His lips parted. What? She leaned closer. "Water." It was barely a whisper. Melanie fumbled in her bag and pulled out her last bottle. It wasn't even half full. She uncapped it and held it to his mouth. He drank greedily, water spilling down his chin, fingers trembling as they grasped the bottle. "I'm calling an ambulance," she said, already dialing. "No. He tried to protest, but the word died in his throat. She ignored him. The dispatcher answered, and Melanie rattled off the address, her voice firm even as her heart pounded. When the call ended, she looked back at him. His eyes were drifting closed again. "Hey, stay awake, okay?" she said, gripping his freezing hand. "What's your name?" No answer. Someone walked by, slowed, and then shook their head. "You really shouldn't touch people like that," a woman muttered, tugging her child away. Melanie shot her a look. "He's a person." The woman didn't reply. Melanie turned back, squeezing the man's hand tighter. "I don't know who you are," she whispered, "but I'm not leaving you." The ambulance siren began to wail in the distance. The man's eyes fluttered open again. He tried to speak, but no words came. She wiped rain from his forehead with the sleeve of her jacket. His skin was clammy, his pulse weak. "I've got you," she said softly. "You're not invisible." Melanie Carter's mornings began before the sun ever thought of rising. The alarm on her prepaid phone blared at 5 a.m., and within minutes she was quietly making coffee in the cramped galley kitchen of their third-floor Flatbush walk-up. The walls were thin, the radiators hissed like angry cats, and the ceiling in the bathroom leaked whenever it rained, which was often, but it was home, barely. After her mother passed away 2 years ago, Melanie became everything her 16-year-old sister Jada needed. Mother, sister, guardian, counselor, enforcer, an emotional anchor. It wasn't a role she asked for, but it was one she took without hesitation. She worked double shifts most days, waiting tables at a neighborhood diner during the day and cleaning offices at a midtown law firm after hours. Her dream of becoming a nurse had been shelved, boxed away along with her student loan paperwork and unopened acceptance letters. There was no room in her world for dreams, not with bills stacking up Jada's braces still unpaid, and rent creeping up every few months like some silent predator. Still, Melanie moved through life with quiet purpose. She left spare change in tip jars, helped old women carry groceries, and always packed an extra sandwich for the homeless man near the laundromat. Her kindness wasn't performative, it was instinctual, a form of rebellion in a world that so often asked people like her to harden, to numb themselves. Even when her ex-boyfriend Caleb tried to wedge himself back into her life with lazy apologies and toxic charm, Melanie stood her ground. Caleb had broken more than her heart. He'd chipped away at her self-worth with gaslighting and infidelity, always leaving just enough hope to string her along. But not anymore. Melanie had built emotional armor out of hard lessons and sleepless nights, and she wore it not to shut the world out, but to survive it with grace. She barely had time for herself, let alone the mess of a stranger slumped on a sidewalk in the rain. But something in that man's eyes had cut through her exhaustion. His weakness wasn't just physical, it was soul deep, like someone who had once lived a life too big and too fast, and now didn't know how to exist in the quiet wreckage. She didn't recognize him. How could she? His hair was overgrown, his jaw unshaven, his expensive face gaunt with hunger. But the man Melanie knelt beside was Ethan Miles, the former golden god of Silicon Valley, once hailed as the tech prophet of the decade. Only weeks ago, he stood atop the world in a glass tower, beloved by shareholders and obsessed over by the media. But then came the plane crash. His wife Grace, the one person who had loved him before the world did, had boarded a jet and never returned. Her death cracked something open in Ethan. The empire he built felt hollow overnight. The boardroom turned into a vulture's nest, filled with lawyers and opportunists, gorging themselves on his grief. So he walked away, left everything, no press conference, no goodbye, just vanished. For the past 3 weeks, Ethan had lived on the streets of New York under a false name, testing himself, testing the world. He wanted to know what it meant to be unseen, to be dismissed, to be human without the armor of power and privilege. The experiment had nearly killed him, and maybe that was part of the point. He hadn't expected to find kindness, especially not from a woman like Melanie, with calluses on her hands and weariness in her bones. She had every reason to walk by, but she didn't. She had sat in the rain, held his hand like it mattered, and whispered, "You're not invisible." Back in her apartment, Melanie rinsed mud off her sneakers in the tub and tried not to cry from exhaustion. Jada was curled on the couch with homework spread around her, earbuds in, completely unaware of how close her sister had come to breaking that day and every day. Melanie didn't tell her about the man on the street. She didn't say that the look in his eyes haunted her, or that she kept hearing his raspy voice in her dreams. Something about him lingered, not just the mystery, but a strange pull, like gravity. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the water-stained ceiling, Melanie didn't know that the man she'd helped was once worth billions. She didn't know he'd made enemies who were still watching, or that her act of kindness had just changed the trajectory of both their lives. She only knew this. The world felt colder every day, but as long as she could still choose compassion, she would dot the hospital room smelled like bleach and stale air. But Melanie walked in with a warmth that seemed to push back the sterility. She clutched a paper bag from the deli down the block in one hand and a folded hoodie and pair of sweatpants in the other. The man still listed as John Doe on the whiteboard above the bed was propped up against a stack of pillows, his color better than the day before, though the bruises under his eyes hadn't faded. He looked up, startled, as she entered. "You came back," he said hoarsely, like he'd meant it to be a question. Melanie offered a small smile and set the bag down on the tray beside him. "Chicken soup," she said. "It's not gourmet, but it won't kill you." His eyes flicked from her face to the clothes in her arms, then back. Suspicion flickered there. Not paranoia, but something older, like he was waiting for the catch. She held the hoodie out to him, figured hospital gowns aren't great for dignity. He hesitated, then took it with slow, deliberate hands. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You don't know me." Melanie shrugged and sat in the plastic chair by his bedside. "You needed help. I'd want someone to do the same if it was my sister lying in the rain." She glanced toward the window where streaks of grey light filtered through the blinds. People walk past suffering every day. They don't mean to. They're just ... busy, tired, scared, maybe. She looked back at him. But I can't live in a world where we don't stop for each other. He studied her, unreadable. You're rare. You're still half frozen, she replied, deflecting the compliment with a lightness that didn't quite reach her eyes. Eat. He took a spoonful, then another, slower this time, like he was still trying to decide whether she was real. Miles, he said eventually. That's my name. No last name. She teased gently. He shook his head, not quite smiling. Just Miles. She let it go. For now, by the time the nurse returned to check his vitals, the soup was gone, and the clothes folded neatly beside the tray. When the discharge paperwork arrived, Melanie stood in the hallway, staring at the sheet of instructions the nurse handed her. Miles had no ID, no insurance, and according to the social worker, a cot in a shelter if he wanted it. He looked at the paper like it was a death sentence. I'll figure something out, he said, voice flat. Maybe day labor. There's always something. Melanie hesitated. Logic screamed to let him go. He was a stranger, after all, but her heart was louder. You can crash on my couch for a few days, she said finally, just until you get on your feet. Miles blinked, as if she'd offered him a palace. That's not just a couch, she repeated, trying to keep her tone casual. No weirdness, no expectations. I live with my sister, and I have Mace. He gave a dry half laugh. Understood. On the subway ride back to Flatbush, he sat beside her, silent but attentive, taking in every flicker of noise and movement like someone who hadn't been underground in a long time. Melanie watched him out of the corner of her eye, how he flinched at the screech of the tracks, how he gripped the pole like it anchored him to something more than steel. She didn't press. She didn't ask where he came from or what had broken. Him, that could wait. What mattered now was that he was warm, alive, and for reasons neither of them quite understood, walking beside her into a life that was about to change forever. Living with Miles had not been part of Melanie's plan then. Again, not much of her life had followed any plan she once imagined. What began as an act of kindness turned into a quietly evolving partnership. Within days of sleeping on her couch, Miles began to carve out a presence in the apartment that was steady, subtle, and oddly comforting. He noticed things: how the kitchen faucet dripped constantly, how Jada struggled with algebra but was too proud to ask for help, how Melanie's journal sketches were scattered across the table but never spoken of. One morning, while she rushed to get to the diner, she came home to find the sink fixed with tools borrowed from a neighbor and a sticky note that read, "Your time deserves better than leaky pipes." Another night, he sat beside Jada with a dry erase board and calmly broke down polynomial equations in a way that made her laugh out loud. And the journals, those dusty ideas Melanie had tucked away between shifts and unpaid bills somehow, turned into a basic but elegant website after a single evening of her describing the vision out loud. Just needed a platform, Miles had said simply. Now you have one. Yet, under the surface of their odd little domestic rhythm, tension coiled in tight, invisible threads. Melanie felt it most at the law office, where Mr. Benson's eyes lingered too long, his hand brushing too close when passing papers, his compliments souring by the end of every shift. She hated how her stomach twisted every time she clocked in, but the job paid more than her diner tips ever could. Rent didn't care about dignity. Miles didn't push, but he noticed. You shouldn't have to tolerate that, he said one night when she came home, quieter than usual. There are other ways to earn. Melanie laughed bitterly, rubbing her temples. Not with no time, no degree, and a 16-year-old to raise. He said nothing more, but the next day, her journal site had a mock ad campaign already queued, and he started teaching her how to track analytics and optimize search listings. It was small, but it was something, a step. Then Caleb showed up. As always, It began with a text. "We need to talk." She ignored it. Then he came in person, waiting outside the diner like a shadow she couldn't shake. He tried charm first, how he missed her, how she looked tired, how maybe that meant she needed someone to take care of her for once. But when she refused, his words turned venomous, eyes narrowing as he gestured vaguely toward the direction of her building. "Word is, you've got some homeless guy living with you," he said, smiling without warmth. "Wonder what CPS would say if they knew your little sister was sleeping under the same roof." Melanie's blood went cold. She clenched her fists, tempted to scream, to shove him, but she walked away instead, her heart pounding and her mind racing. That night, she didn't tell Miles what Caleb said, but he saw something in her expression. She just shook her head and said, "He doesn't matter." But Miles, he did matter. That was becoming undeniable. He cooked when she didn't have the energy. He handled things without being asked. He never tried to pry or push, but somehow made her feel less alone. And yet, something didn't add up. He spoke in ways that didn't match a man down on his luck. He gave Jada stock tips once, in passing, and then backtracked like it had slipped out. He talked about growth metrics and investor psychology like it was casual conversation. And when Melanie mentioned a friend who lost her job to layoffs, he commented too naturally on market volatility. She stared at him sometimes when he wasn't looking, trying to piece it all together. He was kind, yes, and grateful, but there was a composure in him that didn't belong to someone scraping by. There was grief, too, buried deep, but something about the way he carried it was not ordinary. Then came the night he didn't return. Melanie came home from the office late, aching and half-numb, to find the couch empty. His backpack was gone, his coat missing. She waited, told herself he was out walking, maybe needed air, but hours passed. By midnight, she sat alone in the kitchen, her head in her hands, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. The apartment felt colder than it had in weeks, and her mind spun with what she'd feared all along, that this had been temporary, that kindness didn't stick, that people like her were only pit stops for the broken. She had opened her door, and her heart, and maybe that had been a mistake. The lock turned just after 1 a.m. She stood up quickly, wiping her face, masking the hurt in her voice. But when Miles walked in, carrying 2 large grocery bags and snow on his shoulders, he paused in the doorway and met her eyes with an expression she couldn't read: guilt, maybe, or weariness. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I needed to clear my head." He stepped inside and set the bags on the table, filled with fresh fruit, eggs, rice, soap, even some fancy tea she'd once mentioned in passing. He looked at her then, more serious than usual. "I didn't mean to make you worry." Melanie exhaled, her voice small but steady. "You could have said something." "I should have," he agreed. "I'm still figuring things out." She nodded, folding her arms. "Aren't we all?" But as she put the groceries away beside him in silence, her hands moved slower. Something had changed, not in what he'd brought, but in what he hadn't said. She could feel the weight of all the things Miles kept hidden, and yet, somehow, she still wanted to believe in him. Even if she didn't fully understand who he was, she couldn't ignore what he had become, part of her life, part of their home. The knock on the door came hard and fast, fists pounding like they had something to prove. Melanie barely had time to untie her apron before Caleb shoved his way into the apartment. His face flushed, jaw clenched with a kind of fury she hadn't seen before, not jealous boyfriend fury, not even vengeful ex-fury. This was something else. He tossed a folded printout onto the table, a grainy photo circled in red. "You've got a billionaire on your couch, Mel," he said, his voice sharp and breathless. "Ethan fricking Miles. That's who he is." The room fell silent, the air too thick to breathe. Jada, startled, peered out from the hallway, eyes wide. Melanie didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared at Caleb, then down at the photo, and then turned, slowly, toward Miles Ethan, who had stepped out from the kitchen, holding a mug of tea like it suddenly burned his hand. He didn't deny it, didn't flinch. He just looked at her with that same quiet gaze he always had, like he already knew this moment was coming. "It's true," he said simply, voice low. "I'm Ethan Miles." Melanie felt the world shift under her feet, like the foundation of everything she'd trusted cracked in one violent instant. Her knees didn't buckle, but something inside her did. "You lied to me," she said, not shouting, worse, flat, hollow. "You sat here in my home, around my sister, in my life, and pretended to be someone else." Caleb grinned, smugly in the background, satisfied with the chaos, but she waved him off sharply. "Get out, Caleb." He hesitated, surprised by her tone, then muttered something about ungrateful before slamming the door behind him. Ethan stepped forward, but she raised a hand. "Don't," she warned, her voice cracking. "Just tell me why." He looked exhausted, not physically, but spiritually, like this confession had been dragging behind him every day they'd shared a roof. "After Grace died," he began, "everything, collapsed. The company, the people around me, the board. No one cared. Not really. They cared about access, about my name, my net worth. Even my grief got commodified. I couldn't breathe in that world anymore. So I walked away. I wanted to disappear. I needed to know if I stripped all of it away, who was I? Would anyone see me? Or would I just vanish like all the people I used to walk past?" He looked at her then, eyes rimmed with unshed guilt. "You were the only person who stopped, who treated me like a person, not a brand. I didn't plan for any of this. I didn't plan for you." Melanie's throat tightened, but her anger was louder than her sorrow. "So, I was an experiment?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Some kind of empathy test. Let's see how the poor people treat me when I'm not in Armani." He flinched. "No, it wasn't like that. But you let me believe you were just some guy," she cut in. "You let me open my home to you, my sister. You let me carry your weight while pretending you didn't have the means to fix everything I was." Drowning in her voice trembled, not from rage, but from betrayal. "You didn't trust me with the truth. And I don't care how much money you have, Ethan. That's what breaks this." He didn't argue. He didn't beg. Maybe that was worse. He just stood there, hands at his sides, shoulders slack. "I never meant to hurt you, but you did," she said, wiping a tear from her cheek. "And I don't need a billionaire in my apartment. I need people who tell the truth, people who don't see my life as a break from theirs." She stepped back. "You need to go." He hesitated for only a moment, then nodded, slowly, like he accepted the weight of what he'd done. He didn't pack, picked up his coat and stepped quietly into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Jada came into the living room, eyes full of questions, but Melanie didn't speak. She just sat on the couch where Ethan had slept, laughed, fixed things, built things, let the pain settle. He had come into her world like a storm, gentle at first, then devastating. And now, in the aftermath, all she could do was hold on to the truth she still had. She was enough. She didn't need fantasy. She didn't need wealth or a savior. She had survived worse, and she would rise again, stronger without him. Weeks passed, and the space Ethan had once occupied slowly returned to silence, but not emptiness. Melanie moved forward, not out of spite or numbness, but from something deeper, clarity. The day she handed in her resignation to Mr. Benson, her hands didn't even tremble. She walked out of the law office into the crisp morning air with no backup plan except freedom, and that was enough, with what she'd managed to save. And the unexpected momentum her journal website had gained thanks, in no small part to the sleek design Miles had crafted. Orders began to roll in, small ones at first, then a custom bulk order from a yoga studio, then a feature on a local blog that brought in dozens more. She found herself working late, not out of desperation but purpose, filling each package with care, her name handwritten on every thank you note at home. The mood had shifted, too. Jada was lighter, more focused, her walls slowly softening. One evening, she ran into the apartment waving a letter like a flag she'd won a scholarship essay contest. The prompt had been, "Who inspires you and why?" And Jada, in her crooked, brilliant way, had written about Melanie, about strength without recognition, about the kind of love that doesn't shout but builds quietly, day after day. They celebrated with pizza and old movies, the kind where endings were neat and happy. But Melanie didn't crave that anymore. Her story wasn't about escape, it was about becoming. Then, one morning, an envelope slid through the mail slot. Official, thick paper, legal letterhead. Her stomach dropped, some residual fear that Caleb had made good on his threats, or that the past was clawing its way back. But when she opened it, her hands stilled. It was a grant anonymous, full tuition, nursing school, every class, every textbook, covered. Her eyes filled before her brain could catch up. Tucked inside was a second sheet, handwritten in plain ink. "You saved me. I wanted to return the favor. The world needs more of you." No signature, no name. But she knew. Of course she knew. A few days later, a news article made its rounds online. Billionaire re-emerges after disappearance. Ethan Miles speaks on grief, disillusionment, and the power of one kind stranger. The photo was polished, his hair trimmed, his jacket back to being tailored and expensive. He looked like someone from another world again. Melanie read the article in full, sitting with her tea as Jada did homework across the table. The story painted him in soft light, but the quotes were real. He spoke of pain, of being lost, of finding humanity in an unexpected place. He never named her, never exploited her. He just said, "Someone reminded me that I was still human." That kindness is the thing that keeps us from disappearing completely. Melanie closed the tab, let the silence settle, then smiled just a little. She didn't rush to reach out, didn't chase closure or fairy tale endings. Instead, she went back to work, packaging journals for a bridal party order, the scent of fresh paper filling the room. Somewhere out there, he was doing the same rebuilding, remembering, and that was enough. Love didn't need possession to be real. Some stories weren't meant to end with declarations or reunions. Some were meant to teach you that you already had everything you needed to begin again. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden streaks across the pavement as Melanie stepped out of the nursing school building, her backpack slung over one shoulder, and her breath catching in the cool, bright air. Her first day was behind her, intense, overwhelming, exhilarating. She stood on the steps for a moment, letting the quiet pride settle in her chest, then pulled out her phone and texted Jada. "I did it." She smiled to herself, eyes welling for just a second before she blinked it away. Across the street, a sleek black car sat parked at the curb, its polished surface catching the light. The driver's window rolled down part way, just enough to reveal him. Miles, Ethan, clean-shaven now, suited, but not hiding anymore. Their eyes met across the street in a wave. No smile, just a look that held everything unsaid. A nod passed between them. Simple, final. She didn't stop, didn't need to. With her shoulders back and steps steady, Melanie walked past him and kept going, her reflection briefly flickering in the car's glossy side. Some people come into your life to break you, her thoughts murmured as she rounded the corner, her phone buzzing softly with Jada's reply. Others come to remind you that you were never broken to begin with. Melanie stepped out of the nursing school building, her feet touching the pavement like they belonged there as if the ground had been waiting for her all along. The sky above was soft and wide, streaked with the pale blue of a life beginning again. She took a slow breath, the kind that fills you, then pulled out her phone and typed a message with steady fingers. I did it. She hit send, and for a moment, just stood there, letting the moment settle. Across the street, a sleek black car sat, idling, too polished to blend in. The window lowered just enough, and she saw him miles, Ethan. No disguise this time. His face was calm, eyes steady, watching her the way someone watches a sunrise they have no claim to but can still admire. Their eyes met. No words, no wave, just a quiet nod. She gave one in return, then turned and walked past without looking back, her steps unhurried, her spirit unshaken. Whatever they had shared had done its work. She didn't need Maybe he had never come to save her at all. Some people come into your life to break you, she thought, her reflection vanishing in the shimmer of the car's glass. Others come to remind you that you were never broken to begin with.